They exiled her at 14 for lying about the blizzard. Silas Drummond, who had survived 11 Montana winters, told her plainly, "You'll freeze, and that boy will freeze with you." She had $12, an 8-year-old brother, and needed 10 cords of firewood she could not cut. On January 9th, 1887, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. But 5 months earlier, Thea Lindqvist had never bent a single sapling or hammered a tin can flat in her life. The Judith Basin in Montana Territory looked like promise in August of 1886. Rolling grassland stretched toward the Little Belt Mountains, cattle dotted the hills by the thousands, and the settlement of Fork Creek, 23 souls in 7 households, sat along a willow-lined tributary where the water ran cold and clear. Thea Lindqvist was 14 years old and already burying her second parent. Her father had died in May. A horse kicked to the chest while breaking a colt for a rancher named Cobb. 3 cracked ribs punctured something inside him, and he bled into his own lungs over 4 days while Thea's mother held his hand, and her 8-year-old brother Eric watched from the doorway. The rancher paid them $12 for their trouble and kept the colt. Now her mother lay in the same bed, coughing blood into the same rags. Consumption, the women whispered when they brought soup. The lung sickness. It had been coming for months, but grief accelerated it. By late August, Margareta Lindqvist could not rise without help. By September, she could not rise at all. That left Thea. She had $12 from the horse that killed her father. She had Eric, who was 8 and could carry water but not split wood. She had a 1-room sod cabin with a flat roof that leaked when it rained, built by a man who had never seen a Montana winter. And she had approximately 10 weeks until the first hard freeze. The women of Fork Creek did what frontier women did for the dying and the orphan-to-be. They brought food. They sat with Margareta. They clucked their tongues about what would become of the children. But when Thea asked Silas Drummond, the settlement's oldest rancher, a man who had survived 11 Montana winters, what she needed to do to prepare, he laughed. Not cruelly. Worse. He laughed the way a man laughs at a child who asks if she can rope the moon. "You'd need 8 cords of wood minimum," Drummond said. He was 63 years old, built like a fence post, with hands that had broken horses and frozen solid and thawed out again more times than he could count. Cut and split and stacked before November. That's for a cabin this size with a good stove and tight walls. He looked at the gaps in her sod where wind whistled through. "Yours would take 10. Thea did the arithmetic. A strong man with a good axe could cut and split a cord of wood in 2 days of hard labor. She was not a strong man. She did not have a good axe. She had her father's hatchet, which needed sharpening. 10 cords at 4 days per cord, if she could match half a man's pace, meant 40 days of labor. She had 70 days until winter. That left time for nothing else. No hunting, no repairs, no caring for her mother, no food gathering. "A woman alone can't cut that much timber and tend a dying mother and keep a child fed," Drummond said. He was not being unkind. He was being accurate. "The older Cobb boy is looking for a wife. He's got a tight cabin, 8 cords already stacked. You could do worse." Thea had met the older Cobb boy. He was 19, had the eyes of a dog that bites, and his father still owed her family $12 for the horse that killed her father. "I'll find another way," she said. Drummond shook his head. "There isn't another way. This isn't Sweden. You can't wish your way through a Montana winter." He pulled his coat tighter and looked toward the mountains, where the peaks already showed white. "Get those children somewhere safe, girl. Find a husband or head back to wherever your people came from. Because if you're still in that cabin when the real cold comes, you'll freeze, and that boy will freeze with you." He left her standing by the woodpile, 3/4 of a cord her father had cut in April, already half rotted from sitting in the rain. That night, Thea walked to the river, not to cry, to watch. The wolves had been coming down from the high country for weeks, earlier than usual. She had noticed it first in late July, when she saw a pack moving through the basin a full month before their normal autumn descent. The ranchers had noticed too. They cursed and set traps and nailed bounty notices to the general store wall. But no one asked why. Thea asked why. She found their dens in the hillside above the river. Deep. Deeper than the den she had found the previous autumn when she had wandered these hills learning the land while her father worked. Those dens had been shallow scratches, barely deep enough to shelter pups. These were excavations. The wolves had dug into the hillside as if trying to reach the center of the earth. She had seen the geese leave 2 weeks early. She had seen the muskrats building lodges twice the size of last year's. She had felt the thickness of the pelts on the rabbits her father had trapped in spring, the fur of animals expecting cold they could not yet feel. Her mother had taught her to watch animals. In Sweden, before the hunger drove them out, Margareta had learned from her own mother that the creatures knew things humans had forgotten how to see. The old knowledge, the wolf knowledge. The wolves were digging deep. Thea went back to the settlement and told Silas Drummond what she had seen. She told him the winter coming was not a normal winter. She told him the wolves knew. She told him everyone needed to prepare for something worse than anything they had faced. Drummond listened. Then he called over the other men, and she told them too. They laughed. Not the gentle laugh he had given her before. This was different. This was the laugh men give when a child speaks above her station, when a girl thinks she knows something men don't, when someone Swedish and Lutheran and 14 and female tries to tell Montana ranchers how to read Montana weather. "Wolves dig," said Cobb, the rancher whose horse had killed her father. "That's what wolves do. If we built our lives around what wolves did, we'd be howling at the moon and eating raw elk." The men laughed harder. "The girl's scared," another man said. "Her pa's dead and her ma's dying and she's seeing doom in every shadow. It's natural. It's what women do." Thea tried again. She described the geese, the muskrats, the fur thickness. She quoted the old sayings her mother had taught her. She begged them to cut more wood, to reinforce their roofs, to lay in more food than usual. "You're lying," Cobb said. His voice had gone cold. "You're lying to scare people into helping you because you can't help yourself. Your father couldn't break a horse without getting himself killed, and now his daughter can't face a winter without making up stories about magic wolves." He turned to the other men. "Anyone who gives this girl charity is giving charity to a liar. She'll take your help and waste it and come begging for more when the snow flies. I say we let her learn what happens when you cry wolf." No one argued. The next Sunday, no one brought soup. Thea had 70 days until winter, and no one willing to help her survive it. She sat by the river in the cold September dawn and watched the wolves move along the far bank. A female. 3 pups from spring, nearly grown now. The female stopped, looked across the water, and held Thea's gaze for a long moment before disappearing into the willows. The willows. They grew thick along the riverbank, cottonwood and willow and red osier dogwood, their branches supple and green, bending in the wind without breaking. Thea had seen the crow make shelters from bent saplings when her family traveled through their territory on the way to Montana. Curved frames covered with hides, round as turtle shells. The snow slid off them, the wind flowed around them. They looked like something a child would build for play. She looked up at her sod cabin with its flat roof already sagging under its own weight. She looked at the 3/4 cord of rotting wood. She looked at her hands, blistered from the work she had already tried to do, too soft for the work that remained. And she thought about angles. The flat roof of her cabin would hold snow like a bowl holds water. Every inch that fell would sit there, pressing down, adding weight, until something broke. But a curved roof like the bent sapling shelters of the crow would shed snow before it could accumulate. The angles at the shoulders would be steep enough, she tried to picture it, tried to calculate, that snow would slide away rather than stack. It would need to be small. She couldn't bend saplings thick enough to span the width of her cabin. But she didn't need her cabin. She needed shelter for herself and Eric. A space 6 feet wide, 8 feet long, 4 feet high at the center. Room for 2 bodies, a small fire, their blankets, their food. Room to survive. But saplings alone wouldn't hold against a true blizzard. She needed something to cover them, something waterproof, something that would let snow slide. She walked to the refuse pile behind the general store, where the settlement threw its garbage. Tin cans glinted in the morning light. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, accumulated over 3 years of settlement. Tomato cans, peach cans, condensed milk cans. Each one could be cut open, hammered flat, turned into a sheet of metal 5 inches wide and 8 inches long. Metal was smooth. Snow would slide. She began to calculate. 25 saplings for the frame cut from the river bottom. 150 flattened cans for the windward side and crown, overlapped like fish scales. Grass and straw for insulation, she could gather that from the meadows before the frost killed it. A smoke hole at the top covered with a sliding tin sheet. 3 weeks of work, maybe 4. It would leave her no time to cut wood. Clara Hensley found her at the refuse pile, sorting cans into a burlap sack. Clara was the closest thing Fort Creek had to a neutral party, a farmer's wife with 5 children, and too much work to involve herself in settlement politics. She had continued bringing soup for 2 days after the men's verdict, then stopped when her husband told her to. "What are you doing?" Clara asked. Thea explained. Clara listened with her arms crossed and her face growing more skeptical with every sentence. When Thea finished, Clara shook her head. "That's not a cabin," she said. "That's a tent made of sticks and garbage." "It doesn't need to be a cabin. It needs to keep us alive." "You can't heat a tin tent. Metal doesn't hold warmth like sod." "I'll pack it with grass, 6 inches on every side, and the snow itself will insulate once it covers the outer layer." Clara looked at the pile of cans, at the willows along the river, at the 14-year-old girl with blistered hands, and a dying mother, and a theory about wolves. "If you're wrong," Clara said, "you'll freeze faster in that contraption than you would in your cabin. At least sod holds some heat. You're betting everything on an idea that's never been tested." "My cabin roof will collapse," Thea said. "The ridgepole is already cracked. One heavy snow and it comes down. The idea has been tested. The Crow have used it for longer than any of us have been alive." "You're not Crow." "No, I'm a Swedish girl with no wood, no help, and no choice." Clara said nothing for a long moment. Then she turned and walked away. But she didn't tell anyone what Thea was building. The cans disappeared on the 3rd day. Thea had gathered 87 of them, sorted and stacked behind her cabin, ready to be cut and flattened. She woke to find the pile gone and a message scratched in the dirt where they had been. "Liars get nothing." She walked to Cobb's ranch. The cans were there, dumped in a heap beside his barn, mixed with horse manure and rotting hay. Cobb stood on his porch and watched her look at them. "Those are mine," Thea said. "Those were garbage," Cobb said. "Nobody owns garbage. I just moved it somewhere it wouldn't be an eyesore." "You knew I needed them." Cobb smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "I know you think you needed them. I know you've been telling people the wolves told you the future and that you're going to build some kind of Indian tent out of trash. I know you're making the whole settlement look like fools for ever feeling sorry for you." He stepped off the porch and walked toward her. Cobb was not a tall man, but he was thick, and he had the confidence of someone who owned land and cattle and the debt notes of half the families in Fork Creek. "Your father owed me for that horse," he said. "The one that kicked him. I paid him to break it, and it wasn't broke when he died. The way I see it, your family owes me $30 for lost labor and a ruined animal. You think anyone's going to side with a 14-year-old debtor who steals garbage and talks to wolves over a man they all owe money to?" Thea met his eyes. "I didn't steal anything, and I don't owe you anything. Your mother might feel differently. When she's well enough to speak." He smiled again. "If she gets well enough to speak." He walked back to his porch and sat down. "Build your tin tent," he said. "I hope you do. I hope you put everything you have into it, because when winter comes and that ridiculous thing collapses and you come crawling to the settlement begging for shelter, I want everyone to remember who warned them about you." Thea gathered the cans from the manure pile, cleaned them in the river, and carried them back to her cabin. Her mother died 4 days later. The women came for the burial, but not for comfort. They stood at the graveside in the September wind while Silas Drummond read from the Bible, and Eric cried into Thea's skirt. When the last word was spoken, they turned and left without meeting Thea's eyes. She was alone now, 14 years old, an 8-year-old brother, and 47 days until winter. Thea cut her first sapling on the morning after her mother's funeral. The willow grove along the river held hundreds of candidates, young trees with trunks 1 to 2 inches thick, growing 8 to 12 feet tall, supple enough to bend without cracking. She needed 25 of the best ones. She had her father's hatchet, a ball of salvaged wire, and no idea if any of this would work. The first tree took her 40 minutes to fell. The hatchet was dull, and her technique was wrong. She chopped at the trunk like she was trying to punish it instead of cutting it. By the time the willow toppled, her hands were raw and her shoulders burned. 24 to go. She dragged the first sapling to the spot she had chosen, a slight depression in the ground 50 yards from her cabin, sheltered from the north wind by a low rise. The cabin itself was a lost cause now. Without her mother to care for, she could abandon it, let the roof collapse on empty beds and forgotten furniture. She would build something new. Eric watched from the rise as she marked out the dimensions with stones, 6 feet wide, 8 feet long. The ends would be walled with stacked sod. The curved center section would be saplings and tin. "Is this going to work?" Eric asked. He was 8, and he had just buried both parents in 4 months, and his sister was building something that looked like a skeleton made of sticks. "Yes," Thea said. She did not know if she believed it. The days blurred into a rhythm of cutting and dragging and bending. 4 saplings the first day, 6 the second. As her technique improved, she learned to cut at an angle, to use the hatchet's weight instead of fighting it, to let the tree do half the work by leaning into the cut. Her hands cracked and bled and scabbed over and cracked again. She wrapped them in rags torn from her mother's burial dress. By the end of the first week, she had 27 saplings stacked beside the building site, enough for the frame with 2 to spare. The bending was harder than the cutting. She drove the first pair of saplings into the ground 5 feet apart, sinking them a foot deep into the soft soil. Then she tried to bend them toward each other, to make them meet at the top and form an arch. The first one snapped. She had picked a sapling that was too thick, too old, not supple enough. The crack sounded like a bone breaking. She stood there with half a tree in her hands while Eric stared, and the wind picked up, and the clouds piled against the mountains like a warning. The second sapling bent. She had to lean her entire weight against it, bracing her feet and pulling with everything she had, but it curved into an arch and stayed when she lashed the two tips together with wire. She stood back and looked at it, a single hoop of wood, 5 feet wide and 4 feet tall, trembling slightly in the wind. 1 arch. She needed 12. Silas Drummond rode past on the 9th day. He stopped his horse and looked at the row of arches rising from the ground like the ribs of some enormous animal. "So you're really doing it," he said. "Yes." He studied the structure. The arches were set 18 inches apart, lashed together with horizontal stringers woven through the hoops. It looked like a basket. It looked like something children would build for play. "That frame might hold up," he admitted. "Willow's stronger than it looks, but you'll never keep warm in there. Metal pulls heat straight out of the air." "I'm not using the metal to hold heat. I'm using it to shed snow. And when the temperature drops to 40 below, when the wind blows straight through those tin sheets, I'll pack it with grass, 6 inches inside, 6 inches outside. The grass holds air. Air holds warmth. And when the snow falls, it will cover the outer layer and add more insulation." Drummond shook his head. "Grass. You're going to bet your life and that boy's life on a pile of dead grass. And bent saplings and flattened tin. Yes. I've seen sod houses collapse under snow that wouldn't even slow a horse. I've seen men frozen solid 6 feet from their own front doors. This isn't a game, girl. This isn't an experiment. I know exactly what it is." Thea straightened and met his eyes. "It's the only choice I have." Drummond held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode away. He did not offer to help, but he did not try to stop her. The tin work began in the 3rd week. Each can required the same process. Cut off both ends, slice along the seam, hammer flat. Thea salvaged a flat rock from the riverbank to use as an anvil and a round stone to use as a mallet. The first can took her 20 minutes. By the 30th, she had it down to 5. Eric helped. His hands were too small to control the hatchet, but he could hold the can steady while she cut. He could sort them by size. He could carry them to the structure in bundles of 10. He worked without complaining, though Thea caught him crying at night when he thought she was asleep. She had gathered 112 cans when the first frost came. October 17th. She woke to ice on the water bucket and white crystals coating the grass. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees overnight. Winter had sent its calling card. 26 days to go. The grass gathering became desperate. She needed hundreds of pounds of dead grass to insulate the shelter, enough to pack 6 inches thick on every surface. She cut it with the hatchet, bundled it with wire, and hauled it back load after load while her back screamed and her legs cramped, and Eric tried to keep up. The shelter frame was complete. 12 arches connected by 32 stringers, as tight and springy as a woven basket. She had attached the first 40 tin sheets to the windward side, overlapping them like fish scales with the edges bent down to catch less wind. The structure looked like nothing anyone in Fort Creek had ever seen. And then Clara Hensley came. It was the 22nd of October. Thea was on her knees packing grass into the space between the inner and outer layers of the shelter's wall when she heard footsteps. She turned to find Clara standing there with a bundle under her arm. "I can't give you food," Clara said. "My husband would know. But this—" She held out the bundle. "These are clothes my children outgrew, and there's a blanket in there, and some nails. I had nails put back for a project that never happened." Thea took the bundle. Inside were 2 wool coats sized for children, a pair of boots that might fit Eric, a thick blanket with only minor holes, and a paper packet containing 47 iron nails. Nails. She had been fastening everything with wire because she had no nails. Nails would hold the tin sheets tighter. Nails would let her seal the gaps she had been losing sleep over. "Why?" Thea asked. Clara looked at the shelter, at the bent saplings, the hammered tin, the packed grass. At the 14-year-old girl who had spent a month building something everyone said was impossible. Because I looked at those wolves, Clara said. Day before yesterday, I went to where you said they were denning. Those holes go back 6 feet into the hillside. I've never seen wolves dig like that. She paused. I don't know if you're right about the winter, but I know you're not lying. She turned and walked away before Thea could respond. That night, the temperature dropped to 14 degrees. Thea and Eric slept inside the unfinished shelter for the first time, wrapped in their blankets and Clara's blanket, with dried grass piled around them like a nest. The curved walls cut the wind. The grass held their body heat. When Thea woke at dawn, her breath fogged in the air, but she was not cold. It was working, but it was not finished. The tin coverage reached only halfway around the structure. The insulation was packed on the windward side, but thin everywhere else. The smoke hole had no cover. The end walls were incomplete, and the first snow was coming. She could smell it in the air, feel it in the way the clouds sat heavy on the mountains. 11 days until November. She worked 18 hours a day. She cut more grass, gathered more cans, hammered and bent and fastened until her hands were so swollen she could barely close them. Eric filled gaps with mud and grass while she attached the last of the tin sheets. They ate cold food because there was no time to cook. They slept in shifts because there was no time to rest. On October 29th, the first snow fell. 3 inches, light powder. The curved roof shed it like water off a duck's back, while the flat roofs of Fork Creek turned white and heavy. On November 1st, the temperature dropped to 4 degrees above zero. On November 3rd, Thea attached the final tin sheet to the shelter's crown and sat back against the curved wall and cried for the first time since her mother died. The shelter was finished. It was 6 feet wide, 8 feet long, and 4 feet high at the center. The frame was 25 bent willow saplings lashed with wire and salvaged rope. The outer shell was 147 flattened tin cans, overlapped and nailed in a fish scale pattern. The insulation was 8 inches of dried grass packed between the tin and an inner lining of bark strips and more grass. The end walls were sod blocks stacked 2 feet thick. The smoke hole was covered by a sliding tin sheet that could be opened a crack for ventilation or sealed tight against storms. It looked like a metal cocoon. It looked like a tin turtle shell. It looked like nothing anyone had ever built on purpose. And it would have to hold against whatever winter had coming, because the wolves were still digging, the geese were long gone. And somewhere in the north, beyond the mountains, beyond the horizon, something massive and cold and merciless was building. Silas Drummond had said she would freeze. Cobb had said she was lying. They had given her nothing except scorn and stolen garbage and the certainty that no one would save her if she failed. The first blizzard hit on November 16th, then a second in December, then a third. And then on January 9th, 1887, the real winter arrived. The November blizzard dumped 14 inches on Fork Creek in 2 days. Thea watched from inside her shelter as the snow piled against the curved walls, slid down the tin surface, and accumulated in drifts on either side rather than on top. The structure creaked, the saplings flexed, but nothing broke. Inside, the temperature held at 38 degrees, while outside it dropped to 9 below zero. She burned small fires in the stone-ringed pit she had built near the entrance, just enough to take the edge off, never enough to risk the grass insulation catching. The smoke rose through the adjustable hole in the crown and vanished into the gray sky. Eric slept curled against her side, wrapped in every blanket they owned, his breath making small clouds that drifted toward the ceiling and disappeared. The December storms were worse. 2 blizzards in 8 days, stacking another 26 inches on top of what November had left. The settlement's horses stood in snow up to their bellies. The cattle that hadn't been driven to winter pasture huddled against fence lines and froze standing up. Silas Drummond lost 11 head in a single night. Through it all, the curved shelter held. Thea kept a journal on the back of her father's old account book. She recorded temperatures, snowfall, wind direction. She recorded how much fuel she burned and how warm the interior stayed. She recorded the nights when ice formed on the inside of her water bucket and the nights when it didn't. By late December, she had data, real numbers, evidence. 41 degrees inside when it was 18 below outside. 44 degrees when she burned a double ration of fuel. The curved roof carrying no more than 3 inches of snow at any time while flat roofs across the settlement sagged under 2 feet. She was surviving, but the settlement didn't believe it. "Wait until the real cold comes," Cobb said when he rode past on the day after Christmas. He had lost 37 cattle to the December storms, and his face had the pinched look of a man watching his fortune freeze to death. That tin shack might hold in a gentle winter, but this isn't going to be a gentle winter. The old-timers are saying this is 1856 all over again. You know what happened in 56? Thea didn't answer. Half the cattle in Montana froze solid. Men died in their cabins with full wood piles because the cold came so fast they couldn't get their fires lit. You think your pile of sticks and garbage is going to hold against that? He rode on without waiting for a response. That night, Thea checked her supplies. 3 weeks of food if she rationed carefully, enough fuel for 2 more months of small fires. The shelter walls were holding, but she had found 2 places where wind whistled through gaps in the tin. She packed them with grass and hoped it would be enough. The wolves had stopped digging. Their dens were complete. Whatever was coming, they were ready. On January 8th, 1887, the sky turned the color of a bruise, and the wind died to nothing. The temperature at dawn was 4 degrees above zero. By noon, it had climbed to 28. The warmth felt wrong. The stillness felt like held breath. Thea brought Eric inside the shelter and sealed the smoke hole down to a crack. She filled every container she had with snow and packed them around the fire pit so they would melt into drinking water. She checked the lashings on the door flap. She counted her fuel. She prayed to a God she wasn't sure was listening, and she waited. The storm arrived on January 9th at 3 in the afternoon. It came from the northwest, screaming down from Canada like something that had been waiting its whole existence for this moment. 1 minute the sky was gray and still. The next, the world disappeared. Thea was outside gathering the last of her emergency fuel when the wall of white hit her. The wind knocked her sideways. The temperature dropped so fast she felt it like a slap. 20 degrees in 20 minutes, then 20 more in the next hour. Snow flew horizontal, so thick she couldn't see the shelter from 10 feet away. She crawled, hands and knees in the sudden dark, feeling for the curved wall, the tin sheets, the door flap. Eric was inside. Eric was alone. If she died out here, he would die too, an 8-year-old boy sealed in a metal cocoon with no one coming to help. Her hand found tin. She followed it to the door, pulled the flap aside, and tumbled in. Eric was crying. The fire had gone out. The temperature inside had already dropped 15 degrees. She got the fire relit with numb fingers that wouldn't stop shaking, small flames, tiny heat. The wind screamed across the curved roof, and the whole structure shuddered but didn't break. Snow piled against the windward wall, 3 inches, 6 inches, a foot, and slid off the curve in waves, building drifts on either side while the roof stayed clear. The temperature outside dropped to 24 degrees below zero, then 30 below, then 40. By midnight, it was 46 degrees below zero and the snow was still falling, an inch every hour, 16 inches in 16 hours, driven by wind that gusted to 60 miles per hour. The combination of cold and wind and snow created a killing field. Anything caught outside would die. Anything in inadequate shelter would die. The only question was, how fast? Thea kept the fire burning. She fed it sagebrush and dried grass and the few sticks of cottonwood she had scavenged, rationing fuel she couldn't afford to waste because she couldn't afford to freeze. The shelter walls were holding, the tin and grass combination doing exactly what she had calculated, the curved shape shedding snow before it could accumulate, the packed earth floor holding warmth from the fire pit like a clay oven. Eric stopped crying somewhere around 2 in the morning. He was too cold to cry, too scared to sleep, huddled against Thea's chest with his face buried in her coat. She could feel his heartbeat fast and shallow, the heartbeat of a small animal that knows it's being hunted. "Are we going to die?" he whispered. "No." "Promise." "I promise." She didn't know if she could keep that promise, but she made it anyway. At dawn, the snow stopped. The wind kept screaming, but the white curtain parted enough for Thea to crack open the door flap and look outside. What she saw made her stomach drop. The drifts were 6 feet tall. The landscape had been erased, replaced by a white ocean frozen mid-wave. Her shelter sat in a kind of valley between 2 massive drifts that had formed on either side. The snow that had slid off her curved roof had piled up instead of burying her. The settlement was buried. She could see the Drummond cabin, or where the Drummond cabin should have been. A flat roof showed through the snow, but only barely, and as she watched, she saw it flex. Sag. The weight of 2 feet of packed snow pressing down on timber that had never been built to hold such loads. The roof of the Henderson cabin was already gone, collapsed inward, swallowed by white, and from somewhere in that frozen wasteland came a sound she would never forget. Screaming. The Hendersons had 4 children. Thea heard the oldest daughter, 12-year-old Ruth, screaming for help from somewhere in the white. The roof had come down in the middle of the night. The family had survived only because they had been sleeping along the walls. The center beam had missed them by inches. But now they were trapped in a collapsed structure with broken timbers and 2 feet of snow, and a mother who had taken a beam across her hip and couldn't walk. Thea pulled on every piece of clothing she owned, wrapped a scarf around her face, and pushed into the storm. The cold hit like a physical blow. Her lungs burned with every breath. Her eyes watered, and the tears froze on her cheeks within seconds. The wind found every gap in her layers and drove needles of ice into her skin. But she could hear Ruth screaming, and Ruth was 12 years old, and there was no one else. She followed the sound, 50 yards through drifts that came up to her thighs, fighting for every step, her body burning fuel faster than she could replace it. The Henderson cabin was a ruin. The roof had pancaked down, splitting the ridgepole and bringing the sod crashing into the living space. Ruth was visible through a gap in the debris, her face white with cold and terror. "My mother can't move," Ruth said. "The baby's crying. Please, please help us." Thea dug. She dug with her bare hands until they bled, then wrapped them in rags and kept digging. She cleared enough debris for Ruth to squeeze through, then sent the girl back toward the curved shelter while she kept working on the hole. Mrs. Henderson was a large woman, easily twice Thea's weight. Moving her was impossible. But leaving her was also impossible. The temperature in the collapsed cabin was dropping toward the point where survival became mathematics, and the math was getting worse by the minute. "You have to leave me," Mrs. Henderson said. Her voice was steady. The voice of a woman who had made peace with dying. "Take the children. There's nothing you can do." Thea looked at the 3 small children huddled behind their mother. The baby was maybe 6 months old. The middle 2 were 4 and 6. They would die in this cabin before noon if no one moved them. "I'm not leaving anyone," Thea said. She went back for Eric. The next hour was the hardest of Thea's life. She and Eric and Ruth made a human chain, passing the younger children through the gap in the debris and then through the drifts toward the curved shelter. The 4-year-old couldn't walk through snow that deep. Thea carried her on her back, while Eric guided the 6-year-old by the hand. The baby rode inside Ruth's coat, pressed against her chest, screaming with a fury that meant at least his lungs were working. Then they went back for Mrs. Henderson. It took all 4 of them, Thea, Eric, Ruth, and the 6-year-old pulling on ropes made from torn blankets, to drag Mrs. Henderson's bulk through the snow. She screamed when they moved her hip. She screamed when they hit a drift. She screamed until she passed out, which was actually a mercy because unconscious bodies are easier to drag than conscious ones. They got her inside the curved shelter at 9:47 in the morning. The shelter now held 8 people: Thea, Eric, Mrs. Henderson, Ruth, the 6-year-old, the 4-year-old, the baby. And somewhere in the chaos, Clara Hensley's oldest boy had appeared. He had been caught outside during the storm, had seen Thea's curved shelter, and had crawled toward it as the only visible structure in a white world. 8 people, a space designed for 2, barely enough fuel for 1 fire, temperatures outside still hovering at 43 below zero. The math was impossible, but impossible math was all Thea had ever had. She organized them, bodies packed together, sharing warmth. The baby against Mrs. Henderson's chest, with Ruth and the younger children curled around them. Eric and Clara's boy against the opposite wall, with Thea tending the fire and the door. She rationed the fuel, 1 stick every 20 minutes, just enough to keep the interior above freezing, not enough to be comfortable. At noon, the temperature inside the shelter was 34 degrees. Cold. Brutally cold, but survivable. At noon, the temperature inside Silas Drummond's cabin, the sturdiest cabin in Fort Creek, built by a man who knew Montana winters, was 47 degrees. But the Drummond cabin's roof was groaning. Drummond's ridgepole broke at 2 in the afternoon. Thea heard it from inside her shelter, a crack like a rifle shot, followed by a roar of collapsing timber and screaming sod. She pushed open the door flap and saw the dust plume rising from where the Drummond cabin had stood. Then she heard Drummond shouting. She found him in the ruins, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, trying to dig out his wife. The old woman was trapped under a beam, conscious, but pinned. The roof had come down in sections. Most of the structure had collapsed, but one corner still held, creating a pocket of space where Mrs. Drummond lay with her legs pinned and her face gray with shock. "Help me," Drummond said. His voice cracked. This was the man who had told Thea she would freeze, who had laughed when she warned them about the wolves, who had walked away without offering help when she needed it most. Now he was on his knees in the ruins of his life, begging a 14-year-old girl to save his wife. Thea helped him. They couldn't lift the beam. It was too heavy, too wedged into the collapsed structure. But they could dig, scoop out the snow and debris beneath Mrs. Drummond's body, creating a void that let them slide her out inch by inch. It took an hour. Drummond's hands bled. Thea's hands bled. Mrs. Drummond screamed when they pulled her free. Her legs twisted in ways legs shouldn't twist. They carried her to the curved shelter. 9 people now. The space was so crowded that no one could lie flat. Bodies sat pressed against each other, breathing each other's air, sharing each other's heat. The fire had burned down to coals because Thea had been outside too long to tend it. The temperature inside had dropped to 29 degrees, but everyone inside was alive. And outside, the storm raged on. The second wave hit at sunset. The temperature, which had climbed slightly during the day, plummeted again as darkness fell. The wind, which had eased enough for Thea to make her rescues, came roaring back with renewed fury. Snow began falling again, not as heavy as the night before, but steady, adding weight to every roof that still stood. One by one, the remaining cabins failed. The Cobb ranch house held until 8 in the evening. Cobb had built it larger than it needed to be, a monument to his own prosperity, with a roof span that exceeded what his ridgepole could support. When it went catastrophically, the entire structure imploding, sending debris flying outward in a spray of timber and sod and the possessions of a lifetime. Cobb appeared at Thea's shelter an hour later. His face was white. His hands were shaking. His wife walked behind him, carrying their youngest child, and behind her came their 3 older children, all of them silent with shock. "I need," Cobb started. Thea opened the door wider. 14 people now. The shelter had been built for 2. There was barely room to breathe, let alone move. The temperature inside had dropped to 26 degrees because the fire couldn't compensate for so many bodies opening and closing the door flap. But 26 degrees was survival. 26 degrees was life. Outside, it was 52 below zero, the coldest temperature recorded in Montana territory in 20 years. Cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in 2 minutes. Cold enough to kill a healthy man in an hour. Cold enough to end the open-range cattle industry forever. By spring, 60% of the herds would be dead, and the era of Montana's cattle kings would be over. But inside the curved shelter, made of bent saplings and flattened tin cans and 8 inches of dried grass, 14 people huddled together and breathed. Thea kept the fire burning. She had calculated her fuel for a maximum of 3 people over 3 months. She had not calculated for 14 people in a crisis, burning extra wood to compensate for the constant opening of the door, losing heat to the bodies she had saved. By midnight, she was down to 2 days of fuel. By dawn, she would be down to 1. But by dawn, the storm was ending. The sun rose on January 11th over a transformed landscape. The snow lay 4 feet deep across the basin, with drifts reaching 15 feet in places. Of the 7 households in Fork Creek, 5 had lost their cabins to roof collapse. 2 families had survived by abandoning their homes before the structures failed. 3 had been pulled from the wreckage by Thea. The remaining 2, the Millers and the Gundersons, had cabins still standing, but barely, their roofs sagging dangerously under loads they were never meant to bear. And in the center of the devastation stood a curved structure made of bent willow and hammered tin, with 14 people emerging from its single door like survivors from a shipwreck. Silas Drummond was the first to speak. He stood in the snow, his wife leaning against him with her broken legs splinted with pieces of his own cabin, and he looked at the structure that had saved her life. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Thea. "You were right," he said. His voice was hoarse. His eyes were wet, whether from cold or emotion, Thea couldn't tell. "About the wolves, about the winter, about all of it. I told you a woman alone couldn't survive. I was wrong." Thea didn't know what to say. She had imagined this moment, the vindication, the acknowledgement, but now that it was here, she just felt tired. Tired and cold and older than 14. "The shelter held because of the curve," she said. "The snow slid off before it could pile up. A flat roof takes the whole load. A curve sheds it." Drummond nodded slowly. "Show me," he said. So she showed him. She walked him around the structure, pointing out the angles, the way the tin overlapped, the insulation packed between the layers. She showed him the sapling ribs, still flexible after bearing loads that would have snapped rigid timber. She showed him the math, the angles where snow would slide versus accumulate, the R value of grass insulation, the advantage of a small heated space versus a large cold one. Drummond listened, asked questions, listened more. "The crow build like this?" he asked. "Something like it. I adapted their method." "And you figured this out yourself? The angles, the tin?" "My mother taught me to watch animals. The rest I worked out. Drummond was quiet for a moment. Then he said something Thea hadn't expected. My ridgepole was cracked before winter started. I knew it. I told myself it would hold one more season. Easier than cutting a new one. He shook his head. You warned us. We laughed. And then we needed you to save us. He held out his hand. Thea took it. His grip was firm despite the cold. I owe you a debt, Drummond said. I don't know how to repay it, but I intend to try. By midday, the other survivors had gathered to examine the shelter. Clara Hensley came with her husband, who looked at the structure and then looked at his wife and then looked at Thea and said nothing, but his silence had a different quality than before. The Millers came, the Gundersons came, even families from neighboring settlements who had heard about the girl with the tin shelter came to see what she had built. Thea explained it again and again. The bent saplings, the overlapping tin, the grass insulation, the curve that shed snow. She drew diagrams in the snow with a stick. She let people examine the interior, feel the temperature difference, count the layers of protection. This could be built larger, said Gunnar Miller. He was a carpenter by training, a man who understood structures. The same principles, bigger saplings, or timber ribs, larger curve. You could shelter a family. You could shelter livestock. Could you build one? Thea asked. I'd need the specifications, the angles, the layer thicknesses. I'll give them to you. By evening, Thea had written out her construction notes for 3 different families. The dimensions, the angles, the materials, the techniques for bending and fastening. She held nothing back. This was knowledge that could save lives. Hoarding it would be the same as holding the door closed against people who were freezing. Clara Hensley brought food that night. Real food, smoked meat and dried apples and bread that Clara had baked before the storm. She brought it openly in front of everyone, and she set it down in front of Thea and Eric without asking permission. I should have helped sooner, Clara said. I was afraid of what people would say. That's a poor excuse, and I know it. Thea took the food. You brought the nails. The nails mattered. Clara smiled, a thin, tired smile, but real. The nails mattered, but you did the rest. Cobb was the last to approach. He came as the sun was setting, his family settled in the Miller cabin for the night, his wealth destroyed along with his ranch house. He stood in front of Thea and didn't speak for a long moment. You should have let us freeze, he finally said. His voice was flat, defeated. After what I did, the cans, the things I said, you should have kept your door closed. Why would I do that? Because I deserved it. Thea looked at him. This was the man who had stolen her garbage, who had called her a liar, who had threatened her with fake debts and turned the settlement against her. This was the man who had wanted her to fail. Your children didn't deserve it, she said. Neither did your wife. You don't save people because they deserve it. You save them because you can. Cobb's jaw tightened. For a moment, Thea thought he would argue or apologize or do something that would make sense of what had happened between them. But he just nodded once, turned, and walked away into the darkening snow. He never thanked her. He never apologized, but he never spoke against her again either, and when the spring thaw came and people started rebuilding, the new Cobb ranch house had a curved roof. By the spring of 1887, 11 families in the Judith Basin had built curved roof shelters based on Thea Lindqvist's design. Some were small, like her original, meant for emergency use when main structures failed. Others were larger, permanent buildings with timber ribs instead of saplings, metal sheeting instead of tin cans, but the same principles of curve and angle and insulation that had kept 14 people alive through the worst night in Montana's recorded history. Thea taught anyone who asked. She walked through construction sites, corrected angles, suggested improvements. She never charged a cent. The knowledge had come to her free, from watching wolves, from watching the crow, from watching the snow itself. Charging for it would have been like charging for rain. She stayed in the Judith Basin for 37 more years. She married a rancher named Oscar Berglund in 1891, a Swedish immigrant like her parents who had heard the story of the girl who bent the storm and had come to Fort Creek specifically to meet her. They raised 6 children in a house with a curved roof and walls packed with straw. Eric lived with them until he was old enough to stake his own claim, then built a curved cabin of his own 12 miles to the north. Thea Lindqvist Berglund died on March 14, 1924, at the age of 52. The cause was pneumonia, the same lung sickness that had taken her mother catching up with her at last. She was buried beside her parents in the Fort Creek Cemetery, under a headstone that read only her name and dates. The wolves still dug deep that autumn before she died. Some things don't change. On January 9th, 1887, the temperature had dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours, and Silas Drummond, a man who had survived 11 Montana winters, had told a 14-year-old girl that she would freeze. "A woman alone can't cut that much timber," he had said. "You'll freeze, and that boy will freeze with you." Thea had not cut that much timber. She had bent saplings instead. She had hammered tin cans flat. She had packed dried grass into walls 8 inches thick. And when the cold came, 52 degrees below zero, the worst in 20 years, she had opened her door. 14 people walked out of that shelter in the morning light. The wolves had known. Thea had listened, and the snow had slid off her curved roof while the flat roofs of Fort Creek collapsed one by one by one. She had built a tin tent out of garbage and bent sticks. It was still standing when the spring thaw came.